Now, part of my research is studying deception. And in every country I go, they believe the other countries lie much more than we do. Okay? There is no such thing as a bad group. There are only different groups of people who share a common humanity. And this one, there is forgiveness of even the most vile deeds. The last, there was no choice. They had to do it. It's incomprehensible. You say, well, what made you choose to do it? I didn't choose. They needed help. I did it. I had to do it. Now, what I think she's identified very well are some at least tentative criteria, but we need to find out more about what characterizes the compassionate person. If we are to develop a global compassion is a more Western way of saying for all sentient beings. And I think it is increasingly clear, even on a pragmatic basis, that if we care about our grandchildren, we need to have a global compassion. We need to be concerned about everyone's welfare, or even if it's not our welfare, it'll be our children's and our children's that will be in jeopardy. It is become a global village. Now, none of these people, as best she can determine, had any training. And you heard Ben say all the things that they didn't differ on. Many things, no difference. This is the only thing she found. Well, I would like to see much more study of both of three kinds of people. The first, the people who do this in a situation which is out of context, in an experiment. That's how we usually do experiments, it doesn't matter to your past or your future, it's not related. But you act in a compassionate fashion. The second, the second are the people who have acted as heroes or heroines impulsively. And the third are people who, even today in many parts of the world, are continuing over time to put their own lives at stake to relieve the suffering of others. And that's happening in the Middle East, and that's happening in Africa. It's not unique to the 1940s. It happens today. And for each person we identify, we need a control person who is as similar in characteristics, the schooling, where they grew up, their parents' background, as we can do, so that by comparing each pair, we might begin to discover with psychological methods, with neuroscience methods, what differentiates these compassionate people? How did that happen without training, without it being cultivated? They are natural compassionate people. We need many, many more, and if one way of trying to get more is to find out how does it happen naturally. So I want to give as an example a study by Tanya Singer, Wolf's fine daughter, who's sitting here. And can everybody read this? Because I hate to read PowerPoints, but I will if you can't read it. Should I read it?
Read parts of it.
Read it. Okay. Well, what she's done is to use a method of brain scanning, the best we have today, and she finds that the part of the brain that's involved when you have pain is the same as when you perceive someone else's pain. That same part of the brain. For my pain, or if I saw you in pain, same part. That's a very important discovery. We've thought that. Darwin and others wrote about that. But this is evidence on a very specific level. The second is...
His Holiness is wondering whether it is... His Holiness is wondering whether this is, you could say that this is the same across everybody.
And also whether the feeling would be equally intense as well. Is it really the same feeling as pain?
I don't believe it's been replicated cross-culturally, but I don't know any reason. I mean, clearly it should be examined in radically different cultures. Where are you?
Because His Holiness was saying that he can understand for a practitioner who emphasizes the practice of Tonglen, giving and taking, and as a result gets to a point where there's almost no differentiation between someone else's pain and his or her own experience of pain.
There are individual differences.
Some people more than others. But in some people, you do find comparability.
So you can say both. It is a very automatic thing, but on an unconscious level, you are not aware that you feel pain. But then there are huge differences between people. Some show very high amounts of...
The unconscious level,
now that opens up, of course, an extremely important research question, is what's the difference between those who show very similar and very strong and those who show very slight? And what can we learn about that might help us train people? Because my focus today, and at this point in my life, is the practical, is how can we use this to increase compassionate behavior. I'm interested in it intellectually, but much more focused on how we can apply it, but we need more knowledge. And this is a method. Now she's got another result which is up there, which I'm hesitant to report because it makes men look so bad.
The research taken the ancient more
if the other person acts unfairly, women still respond more compassionately, not the men. They want revenge. Now, I'll bet you, though, there are some men who are more like the women and some women who are more like the men. And so once again, that's a harder test. You've been cruel to me, it's hard to say, but you suppose you have been cruel to me, and yet this is fundamental to your notion of forgiveness, which I've come to. It took a long time to come to believe that that is the right notion, that every act is forgivable. You remember, we spent a long time arguing about that. But there's no, if you've been nice to me, that's no test. It's when you haven't been, when you've been unjust. And many of the examples you use and you describe in your book with Victor are of the most severe injustice and cruelty. And yet to still, well, that's what we want to cultivate. And some people from this experimental paradigm can help us to identify some people where it's there naturally. So we need to study those people.
Can I ask one question?
Please.
in the study, was the difference between, how did the difference between men and women compare to the differences within men and within women?
So first, I mean, in fMRI study, you only have
Tanya, here's the mic.
저거다 지면 버루리아 시
Ran.
마루마 제요나 대야 남비디 다디 소베다 지단지는 체도서로 그런 거를 쉬어야 돼. 저거다 지면이 버루 개바다 저거 난고 개바 지존데 개바 갈도서. Yeah.
So first I want to say that it had to be replicated, yeah, because in fMRI study we study not huge population and not across cultures, so that's. But the astonishing thing I really saw is in each of the men I studied, there was a desire of revenge if they saw someone being punished or getting pain which had cheated on them before. And in the women, there were variation. There were 3 women which behaved like the man, and then most of the women didn't felt any desire for revenge. So there was a striking difference between the group I tested, but that, you know, it might be very different in groups of practitioners or also in other cultural groups, and that's what we have to look into that. And what perhaps I could say is that we found instead in the man on average, but also individually, we said instead of empathic brain responses, we saw reward area lighting up. So ventral striatum, which is a reward-related area, and the more they subjectively expressed a desire for revenge, the more this area lighted up. So that. And that's an area which is activated if you get chocolate or something you desire. So it's.
Milia, the Jozo, the Ching Marumachi, the Delia, that Donlenja, Jidashaloaki, the Bashukberwa, the Kolkeshavena, and the Levalia, you could have such a the Sevakitugalia. Seven Debat and Sevakitugal, you could have such a quite the Chiguritas, but the chocolate sign in the one the day, Sever Vistiana. Marita dish, the landlawyer in Gorbono. Desire for revenge. Yeah, that makes sense because there is a strong desire there.
So I mentioned this study as an example of the kind of research that could start, once repeated and extended and replicated, that could start to identify for us people that who show the most compassionate behavior under the most adverse circumstance in an experiment, who we could then study with other methods to try to learn why this is so. Just as we can take people from the world who do this, and can that give us information we can use in a practical level, which I'll get to in a moment. I want to distinguish between, since this is talking about empathy, 3 kinds of empathy. The first is to recognize how the other person feels. If I don't know that you're suffering, then how am I going to respond?
The empathy level,
Now, knowing how you feel, Tanya's study and real world shows, I may know how you feel and not care about it. I may know that you're suffering and want to make you suffer more. It feels so good, gets you so unhappy. So it's the first step, but not sufficient. The second is totally different. It is to feel what the other is feeling, and I'd like to distinguish 2 types. I love to use my wife as an example. If you remember, 7 years ago, I used my wife as an example also, and she has forgiven me for that. So I now feel I can always use her in my lectures. So
you have 7 more years to be forgiven.
So she comes home, and she's had a meeting with the head of the university, and she asked him for support for students, and he was not sympathetic. and she's very angry. I can use this example because she is now resigning as dean. Yes? Okay. So she's very angry. She comes home and she tells me this, and it's clear she's angry at him. Well, one kind of resonance is I get angry too. Not angry at her, with her. Oh, that chancellor, what a mindless person. How could he act that way? I'm furious. I'm going to write him a letter. So I'm resonating with her feeling. Another kind of resonance is I say, oh, you poor baby. How could he act? How could he not see the merits? Now, I'm having a feeling. It's not the same feeling, but it's a resonant feeling. Okay? People like both. Sometimes they want one. Now, the third is a compassionate concern to relieve the suffering. What can I do to help you think of other ways to deal with your problem that the chancellor hasn't met? How can I help you? How can I help you with your anger so that it doesn't distract you from what you... So this is... Now, you don't need step 2 to go from step 1 to 3. And in fact... And in fact, it is the belief of some people that if you always go through step 2, if you're dealing, let's say, on a children's cancer ward, and you're seeing these children who are dying all the time, when you deal with their parents, they don't want you to cry. They're crying. They don't want the resonance. They want the compassionate concern. And just a momentary digression, another thing to thank Adam for is the amazing group of people that he's invited here that I've been able to talk to in the break, who are so involved in different aspects of compassion, whether it be in the prisons or with the social workers. It's an amazing audience. So thank you for that too. So we don't really know for these heroes and heroines, for these rescuers, for Tanya's subjects, are they having the resonance? Hers suggests they're having the resonance. But are these others? Or is it just from step 1 to step 3? Let me turn to a second way science can help us, and that is in evaluating the efficacy of different approaches to cultivating compassion. 7 years ago, Alan Wallace was sitting where you're sitting, and at one point in the meeting, Alan said, we need emotional balanced gymnasiums where people can go and learn emotion. Why? You just go to the gym to work out physically? Why not go to a gymnasium to balance your emotions? So with thanks to Alan, how about compassion gymnasiums? Where instead of seeing how much you weigh, you monitor what is your level of calmness versus stress today. Where there are different exercise machines in the gyms we have now. There's a meta-attention exercise room. A loving kindness exercise room. A biofeedback mind training room. A cinema room where you will see the suffering that results from violence, because the studies that have been done have shown that all the violent acts, and an average child sees 10,000 acts of violence by the time they're 13, but they don't see it in the context of the suffering it causes. That the programs leave out. Violence. Another movie room where you see the heroes and heroines of compassion. Reading this woman's book is John, like the anthropologist. He's talked about a feeling of elevation. Yes, Jonathan Haidt. You read about what others have done that are deeply compassionate, it starts to help transform you. And the compassion game room, I've gotten to know the designers of 2 half-billion-dollar games. And one of them is very interested in developing a game that you play with other people where you learn compassion and the benefits of compassion. In the young generation, a lot is learned through games, not through books, not through movies. There's no reason not to try this. Now, we don't have evidence for any of these. But I don't put this up as a joke.
I mean, Paul, we realize that this is kind of a wish.
Yes.
But would you say they are feasible?
I think we need to mount a program of research on compassion that begins to use some of the methods you've heard about, some of the neuroscience methods, that uses the methods that Tanya has used experimentally, and we begin to see what's effective. My bet is that just like I prefer the treadmill to the exercise bike, that people will find there won't be one technique that's the best for everyone. People will find what's useful for them, and you give them a free array and do it in a research context. So I hope that you will say at one point, is this just going to be good talk, or is something going to happen?
Yeah.
No.
I think really worthwhile to make effort.
Yes.
Maria.
So this time I look at Adam. Okay. And there are people beginning to work on each of these. It's not as if we start from scratch. I will switch topic. Now, my research is on emotion, and so when I think about consciousness, I think about it in 4 different ways. And I start with the belief, not the scientific fact, but the belief that nature did not make it easy, didn't equip us to make consciousness to any one of these 4 easy, that they all have to be cultivated.
Will you explain?
I will. I'm going to take them one by one.
Yes, yes.
Sometimes when I become emotional, it's through a process of thought. And I think about, why is John looking at me in that way? Oh, now it's, yes, okay, so he's pleased with what I'm saying, but is he really pleased? Okay, it's raised one eyebrow. So it's a whole process of... But I don't think that that's either the only or the most common way emotions begin. And there is evidence to suggest that very complex evaluations, like in the near-miss car accident, which involves a lot of calculations about the speed of that other car and the angle and how much you have to adjust the steering wheel and the pedal, pressure, incidentally, all learned behaviors, and that happens in milliseconds without thinking. If you had to think about what to do, and is it really a problem, should I slow down, you'd be gone. So we are capable of this extraordinarily fast appraisal awareness. This, incidentally, is Dan Goleman's phrase, appraisal awareness. And usually it isn't until afterwards. Now, this can save us our lives or get us into a lot of trouble.
남도 그 괜찮지.
누구라도 시험을 해.
루부터 니버트래. 당부디 더 코나스나 이모션 그 망보지 근데 그 남도 그 나한테 이제 용 말했어. 이네들 이제 용이 말했어. 너무 미지답지라.
Sorry, appraisal awareness is this your example of that is the car situation?
Near car accident.
알레.
It can be it can and often is.
네트 컨디 이미 뺏겼고 하고 저 그래.
너무 건배왕 그러거든. 검사를 제일이야다. 잘 상담으로. 그도 그런 상황이에요.
Let me clarify as
No.
my friend Richie points out, and should put it more precisely, is that the appraisal is something we can usually not be aware of. It's impenetrable.
카도 될 동네 제고 두고 딱 오늘 저는 지금나 구주다 레벨도는 제버치 두고라 그 체험 보시고지 지도 무슨 뭐 보시고 뵙고 그랬어
맞습니다 공도
때나 이내 지겨버데 가서 그런 농원도 줄고요 말아 딱고 내가 삼단가 제베나 당한테 가르치고도 삼단도 되고 다행이가 그랬어.
Now the appraisal gives rise to a set of impulses, but let me just call it one impulse for simplicity. What I believe in, the Buddhists write about as the spark before the flame. 50 years ago, exactly. 50 years ago, I was completing. 50 years ago, I was completing my training as a psychotherapist, believe it or not. And my supervisor said, if you can increase the gap between impulse and action, you will have helped your patients. And what he should have said to me, and that's very hard to do, and it'll certainly take more than 1 hour a week. But impulse awareness is possible to become, and there's a lot of writings of yours, of Matthew's, of others that I've read, about being able to be aware of the impulse and not engage with it.
impulse gezielt kon die gender
Now, even someone like me, who's only a sporadic meditator, I can sometimes, not always, but sometimes detect the impulse and let it pass. Like, I visualize anger as a ball of cactus that is rolling very fast, and I step to the side, and it just goes away. Yeah? So, I wish that happened all the time, but that it's possible some of the time, and I would presume with more regularity of practicing, you can achieve it more of the time. Behavior awareness is the third. You didn't recognize the impulse. The flame has happened. You point out that words come faster than action. So you're already starting to say things. Let's use anger, because that's the emotion that we most often regret. So you're already starting to say things that if you thought about, you either wouldn't say them at all, or you would say them in a kinder fashion, directed more at the act than the actor, as you point out. But in order to do that, you have to be aware that that's what you're doing. Now, you would think that if you're acting emotionally, you would have to know it. Not the case. But there are these same exercises, the same practices that help behavior awareness help impulse awareness. And there are Western approaches to this, some of which I've developed and some others, that mesh perfectly. For example, we have a set of exercises to teach you to be more aware of the sensations in your body, so that when those sensations begin, it registers in consciousness, and you say to yourself, I'm getting upset. You have no opportunity to disconfirm, to disengage, or if you engage, to engage constructively unless you're aware. And it's my belief, supported only indirectly, is that for most people it doesn't come naturally, it needs to be cultivated. The last, the empathetic awareness, the recognition of how another person feels, that's very easy to acquire. We've developed technology that virtually everyone can learn to be much more aware of the feelings of others in an hour or two. And that can be very useful to knowing how you feel. Because if I recognize the look on your face, it tells me something I'm doing is causing you to respond. So it can help me to know how you feel, to know myself.
No, then the empathetic awareness, the labia elaborations, choose Jesus now sometime Jangbe and the Chitu to Skanda Panango, Nong Sor, Kariki, you might, so the long sometime, Panango, Lamsa, Landa, Malan Theatre, Lamsa, Sobachitu.
So I would change my heading here to consciousness is a primary characteristic of a good emotional life, or a constructive emotional life, but not a given.
Consciousness is consciousness the Mrs. Sambukiaki in a challenge reshas, Kichu Sangunis, Mrs. Yakushia.
Well, we've already talked.
Then the consciousness said, "Do you want to donate the session to you?" The Tuzang Yamena, Chivakarsa. Tuzang Yamena, Yamlenalia. Session to Chuba, say to what deep Trushatakanda.
I've already, in terms of emotion, suggested, and you haven't disagreed with me, that consciousness is not given by nature, it has to be cultivated. For each of these, or for at least the three where it's possible.
Now, the appraisal, the impulse, the behavior, the empathy, empathetic, tol shebe na ta consciousness to kora se so lo ngon to jibe to shebe se che de ko le ko ne di ma jo nam she se de ko je ge smare di ge di ne rang shin len ge to ne ni yo je men do lo jang je ge ko ni je shas
되게 안 biological 때는 시작이 보기죠. 영향이 뭐래? 안 conscious 영향. biological 영향이 뭐래?
So wouldn't you say in the case of the three, kind of earlier consciousness that you're talking about, wouldn't there be individuals who would be naturally capable of doing this?
Wonderful question. I don't know whether there are. I mean, we've studied Matthew in our laboratory like many scientists in America. Was he always like this? You see, now there is research of Ritchie's, of Cliff Sarrence, there's research that's looking before and after, and there is some evidence, I believe, in Ritchie's data and in other data that suggests there might be some people, just like those exceptional, compassionate people, there might be some people who have exceptional consciousness. And I would expect that Ritchie would find different neural circuitry, that they're not like the rest of us.
Matthew's mother said that he wasn't always like that.
But Matthew told me, don't trust what my mother said.
Matthew was a lab mate of mine 40 years ago, and he wasn't like this.
Well, that's important. We really need to round up the whole circle of acquaintances who knew him. But this is a general methodological issue. If we're going to study people 20 or 30 years later, as we're doing, is to find out systematically about their earlier life, as well as the longitudinal studies that need to be done. And as I knew it would occur, but I didn't know exactly where, this idea that there are people who have emotion consciousness naturally. I can think of tasks we can develop to identify them, and then we can find out how it happens. And maybe that can help us bring this about more quickly or effectively for other people.
Biology tone rangshingi nebatende yote miyo na lebe chane namju tone mikuma da mandaji pejana bitengu res tene tanande tanamado da kamor kosa.
The next issue I wish to address is really quite different, and so I've suggested to Ritchie that perhaps we take a tea break now and then come back to this issue of whether there are emotions that are fundamentally afflictive or whether all emotions can be enacted in a wholesome fashion. Okay?
Thank you. 15 minutes.
I want to return to the gymnasium because I did not mean this in jest, and many people in the break told me how eager they are to see this started. And the calmness stress weighing scale is only one element, but it is an element that the American government has asked me to try to develop so that we don't keep putting people into dangerous situations who then act in a regrettable fashion. And I've recruited Ritchie, and we will be working on the development of that component. It's the easiest. I wanted to ask you if
under which ministry? Defense.
Defense. But police have also
Hopefully under education.
police have also asked, how can we tell when we should tell a officer, don't go out on the street? You're not in good shape to go out on the street with a weapon. It's an important question. So it's not a bad, similarly, if we could not have soldiers go out into combat or danger situations where they commit atrocities because they don't have the calm. We have to get them to a level of calmness so they can act in a considered, conscious fashion.
That's right.
I wanted to ask you if you would take some time now before I go to the end of my presentation, which is only about 5 or 10 minutes at most, but to tell us are there any things in this list that you think aren't worth trying?
exercise mind training lojang ba tapshi de ni biofit lab de ko su lu bu ya ji da lo ta de ja na ni pine su the kind of signal de tong len de adjust che mind training ji dan de ne chinda de git de ba dan de lo nye de pe du su che ba dan du ngen nyong ni nyang bo tong gu du su de mang ba ji ge dan du su che ba de ba ma do ti je bu du ngen to de ge ma res shi ba de shu de da hero de yun de compassion de che and ma de compassion
I think it's the third loving kindness exercise rooms. The loving kindness lokora pemberishiro.
Laren. So when we speak of loving kindness, we are talking about a state of mind that is beneficial.
The first, second can be either.
Yeah. So you can have a matter attention towards both negative and positive.
Do you think it's necessary, though, for it to be developed?
The loving kindness at the sha.
So what would be helpful perhaps is to keep loving kindness exercise as the key, and then you can have different aspects of the practices.
In order to do that.
In order to do that,
Now
like a kind of methods, like metta attention and
some kind of instrument to improve loving kindness. Maybe good.
What else should be here that isn't on the list?
I don't know.
Really?
Unless you, this Holiness was saying, unless you tell me, I wouldn't remember.
Someone else who's learner,
So when someone else starts the discussion, then it triggers his memory.
Your Holiness, just in relation to that, one, the first thing on Paul's list is the calmness stress scale to evaluate the extent to which a person is maintaining levels of equanimity. And one of the things that, and this is something that Arthur pointed out just now, one of the things that is so well developed in Buddhist practice are methods to cultivate equanimity, but also I'd be interested in what Your Holiness has to say about how we can assess equanimity in others. How can we tell?
가사 짠짠 띄우충원에서 가사 샤징이 띄우추 샤징이 냐를 띄우 머신에 냐를 컵떴습니다.
No. So
당연 못 이미.
So there is a So there is a statement in one of the texts where it says, I think it's a Pramanavartika, yeah, it's Dhammakirti's text, where in describing the quality of the Buddha's compassion and equanimity, there's a statement, and there's a line which says that someone who treats equally, without discrimination, on one side of his body, someone is trying to anoint it with sandalwood perfumes and so on, and pamper it, and on the other side, someone else is chipping away with a with a knife or a dagger. So maybe that's the test.
True cruelty.
Yes, too cruel.
That guy to test it.
Won't pass the IRB.
Wouldn't pass Human Subjects Committee. Human Subjects Committee would disapprove.
That's the test. Committee disapprove.
I think the teamwork. Usually, we cultivate equanimity. Visualize someone who don't dislike.
Whom you dislike.
Like enemy, and visualize one friend, visualize one neutral person, then check the attitude of our mind. Firstly, subjective.
Of course, we're talking about subjective experience, yeah.
Yes.
Then, person, so therefore, maybe,
so maybe one way of doing this is to show that person as someone that the person dislikes. A photograph of an image, and then image of a friend.
What's the reaction from other side? More or less calm.
Then it's an indication.
And we can measure this physiologically. It's actually a wonderful suggestion for a measure of equanimity. The fewer the differences between friend versus enemy, the more equanimity.
Again, I think it does not mean the
so we're not talking about so of course we're not talking about someone who's totally like a zombie who has no recognition of who is an enemy and who's a friend. We're talking about ordinary people who have clear recognition of someone as an enemy, someone as a friend, or someone that you dislike or someone that you like. But on the basis of that, what we are trying to see is whether the person is capable of responding with equanimity, so they're not responding out of that consideration of the discrimination.
Yeah, I've developed an exercise that I use in my teaching called respectful disagreement, in which we ask the person to imagine the other person is a particular political leader that they can't stand. Very easy to do in California. And to try now it's done, and to try to talk to that person in a respectful way and express your disagreement to him. For many people, there's so much hatred involved. Let me go back in time. There were people who were so disappointed when Nixon was out of office because they thrived on their hatred for him. It's very dangerous. It becomes addictive. And the
Nixon, yeah, touchy Magawa Yoins, Nixon, Zamshajiwala, Kuduma Gibchungas, the Tangsim Dibi, she was the common Garuna Telia. Shepherd Chagos, Nixon Tangsim Yorwa.
No, Nixon tuning.
Nixon Chutu, that Tanguch is Yamara. Nixon Cheva Gabliata, Motinich.
Matthew.
Yes, when we speak of loving kindness exercise room, I think we really like to request His Holiness to know what are you going to exercise. So we would like to some of us may not be all aware of how do you actually cultivate loving kindness. What different types of loving kindness and compassion can offer a secular training in human quality, but inspired by the wisdom and experience of Buddhist training. So 2 years ago in Stanford, Your Holiness really clearly gave a wonderful picture of different kinds of compassion and how to develop them. So I think it would be very timely if we could request you to give
another
us...
occasion.
Right?
This is, I think, a session of discussion.
Yeah, but you should speak.
Well, if I could,
I think 1,000 times, because I speak, you see, about compassion. I think 1,000 times, at least a few hundred, in many places.
So
you see, you can, if someone is very serious, then you can collect.
You can extract.
Okay, then maybe one more precise question about what Paul was saying. When he described the two types of empathy and concern for his wife being very upset. And one was to somehow feel the same anger and share anger.
Resonance. No?
The other one was to be extremely kind, but not necessarily feeling the emotion. So, in a way, it seems that the second one is maybe slightly more attuned to the Buddhist approach, or be just overwhelming kindness, but not necessarily feeling the anxiety or the anger or the fear of the other person. Actually, be very comforting. So,
이걸 가가로.
말이죠.
변화한데 미디어한테 참고 제마 소소야 저와들라 롱랑 쪽으로.
말이에요.
야, 저와디 제겐기 미디 그 가서래 라와 여신 가시 조신도 이 마찬가지 지금 알아. 지금 알아.
말이에요.
거래 그 차당 시험도 손선인다. 몽배 시험도 손선인다. 근데지고 안에 그 가다 스위밍기 자주 텀으로. 그래서 그 유대차려야 가서 되게 actor the actions are your share.
So here, I mean, this is with response to your question of resonance and so on Matthew's point. We can still maintain a distinction between the act that was done by someone that is that you disapprove, and you can have, based on that, a sense of outrage and even anger necessary
About the action.
About the action, but not to the actor, because there you can understand that perhaps the person was compelled to do it. There was no other choice. There could be all sorts of reasons why the person had to act in a certain manner.
When someone...
As far as the action is concerned, someone have to oppose.
Sure.
Otherwise, injustice is always because of gain. Right? Will gain. So we have to oppose.
But in case of his wife being upset, and for empathy, do we need absolutely to feel the person's emotional state? But that's very important for the research in empathy. Do we have to feel the other person's suffering or anxiety or fear? Or we simply need to be extremely kind without necessarily
concerned.
Yes.
Concerned.
So, for example, there's some, in some cases, for example, the Garrison Institute is working on people who, when they're working with people who have trauma, they start to get traumatized. They get what's called vicarious trauma. And so they're trying to be compassionate, but they get so much, they feel the trauma of the other person. They feel the anxiety or the suffering of the other person. And because they feel the suffering, then they have difficulty having compassion. So is it, how do we train compassion? Do we need to feel the emotion of the other person?
Or we just try to be more and more compassionate?
So do we, if someone is very sad, do I need to feel their sadness?
So there is a recognition in the Buddhist tradition that So there's a recognition in the Buddhist tradition that
진짜 도저히 싫어고 찾으셨고 그래.
So there is a recognition in the tradition that compassion actually necessarily involves taking upon some kind of pain of the other. In fact, in the very etymology of the Sanskrit term for compassion, which is karuna, has the notion of stopping happiness or stopping pleasure, or one could almost say interruption of pleasure.
Interruption of pleasure.
Interruption of pleasure. And the idea here is that in experiencing compassion, you are taking on the other's pain, which has this interruption of one's own, experience of happiness and joy. So that's part of the understanding of compassion. So in Shantideva's text, recognizing this, he emphasizes the role for wisdom. The compassion practice needs to be complemented with greater insight and a stronger use of intelligence and insight, the wisdom component.
So if I may ask a question then, if we are going to have compassion for someone else, do we always have to feel their pain first to have compassion? Because
신이 동네 서울도 구르베스.
so 고그룹에 인지미지 고그룹에
고면로 고면로. 배는 인지 장년이 민중 사바 장고하고 내가 이제 두고.
고그룹.
고그룹.
Yeah,
셴 동네지 나오면 미스별로 숙자고 영어리야. 동네지 랑데도 서 미스별로 뭐 주나? 무지지 말아.
So in response to John's question, His Holiness's answer is yes, because in the kind of order of cultivation of compassion in the Buddhist tradition, one of the suppositions made is that, first of all, the individual needs to have the capacity of experiencing one's own pain and feeling unbearable. So without that basis, you cannot empathize with others' pain and suffering. So on that...
Do you have to do that each and every time? So if you see 10 people get brought into your emergency room...
Therefore, there was this story of... So there was this Tibetan master, a master of a compassion practice known as Langri Tangpa, and he was known as the weeping Lang Tangpa because he was constantly contemplating on the sufferings of countless numbers of sentient beings. So apparently he was weeping most of the time. And it is said that he laughed only 3 times in his life. His Holiness was saying that it can't be true. He must have laughed a lot, at least when he was young.
Did the weeping prevent him from acting?
Oh, that's the question now. That's the
So what is required is that, when thinking about others' suffering, and when you have this strong experience of pain, what is required for strong compassion is the lack of
discouragement.
Discouragement.
There is danger. Discourage or helplessness.
Yeah.
Shumba majong top kare. Shumba majong top kare.
Because if the doctor...
Shumba, what would be better? How do you translate Shumba? Matula.
To lose one's inner strength and yes, feel hopeless.
Discouraged is actually kind of good because it means not having.
You feel despondent and powerless.
Yeah, despondent. Yeah.
Because if the doctor on the battlefield is crying all the time, he's not going to cure anybody.
So that he doesn't.
So he needs. Shumba majong top.
That the la should that the get just you know tell me get just me tell me no, that remember because never yet. What about that?
So the compassionate person.
The changes about the need to go as it is ready. So do you do something? Nish Kongora. Do you do me get Marta? Do you do me marry? Do you do something? Do you do me? 머리고 시험하지 시리얼 머리고 세로이 뭐 통되어.
그래.
봐. 땡기더라. 돈이도 다 없나? 봐. 돈이도 다 땡기지 좋아도 전에 배 검니 지기는 등신 가서 자원에 방 고토야 이러지. 땡케 이르잖아. 닝시삼네 가서 동해진 저놈이 신도 와
So,
저놈이 신배 타네 땡이시 게임이야
so in the,
단지 총사로서 자지 다 되게 다 내려서 다 자이 다 동해서 타면 다 걸어 도경을 쓰지네 말아야
so in the case of
해주셨으면 저놈이
Matthew's
제 집에서
example of doctor working on the field, constantly crying, not being able to do anything. Here, a verse from Shantideva may be very helpful, where he says that if there is something that can be done, then there is no need to get upset, and if there's nothing can be done, then there is no point in being upset. So that kind of realistic perspective would be important. Now, with respect to the Bodhisattva practitioners who are cultivating compassion, but in their case, they are talking about they are cultivating the altruistic aspiration, and which is really grounded upon when they for the Bodhisattvas, when they generate compassion to see that aspires all sentient beings to be free from suffering. Here, the level of suffering they are concerned with is not just what we would ordinarily, conventionally characterize as suffering. They are actually Bodhisattvas' perception of suffering, that they wish all beings to be free of. No. Bodhisattva practitioner. So here, the suffering, the meaning of suffering is the conditioned existence within unenlightened round. So, and this kind of wish to see others free from suffering is really accompanied with a very clear recognition that there is a solution to the suffering. There is a possibility. So, and this is the wisdom component. So there's a strength, there is a sense of confidence that this can be done, and therefore the compassion is accompanied with the kind of a feeling of courage.
Actually, he actually expounded 3 kinds of suffering. The obvious suffering that we all witness. Then the suffering of change. We are happy and then suddenly some catastrophe happens. And at the deeper level, which is dealing with ignorance, with ego clinging and grasping and all those basic ignorance, that makes suffering being able to happen all the time. So that can be antagonized to wisdom. And if I may recall a wonderful example that his Holiness gave once in France. He said, if you just see someone that is fallen in the ocean from the aeroplane, and you know that you can't do anything, you feel great pity and sorrow for that person. But it's not quite the same if that person has fallen in the ocean and you see that in the mist there is an island very nearby, and that person could reach the island. So then your compassion and may that person reach that island will be 1,000 times stronger. So to know that there is a way out of suffering, to remitting to ignorance, that's magnify your compassion much more than just simply wishing that this immediate suffering be removed.
There's another element I would like to get your reaction to, because on this topic, because I've been talking with my daughter a lot about it, who you've met, because she now works in a emergency room, and every week she deals with the parents of teenagers who've been killed in gang warfare, and the issue of her, she has to help these parents deal with the loss of their children. She also has to deal with the fact this happens 2 or 3 times a week, week after week. So she helps this parent, there'll be another one 2 days later. And I think there are 2 things that she needs. One, and I'm getting this all from you and giving it to her, but I want to be sure you would agree. One is... she must enter in a state of calmness. Well, if she comes to work agitated, then it's going to be much harder for her.
Yes.
She'll be more likely to be overwhelmed by the situation. So it's the preparation. Before you enter, you must prepare yourself to enter such a situation. You agree on that?
Did it?
Yes.
And the second is a harder one, particularly for many people is for your goals to be modest. She can't change gang warfare, but she can help the situation. If she thinks, why can't I change the whole city of San Francisco? That's not, then she'll get overwhelmed, she'll burn out. She must have,
yes,
so,
yes,
yes, what practice to develop that?
yes, right from the beginning, you should be realistic. Realistic.
So being more realistic. So right from the beginning, it's better to set a goal that is more realistic and then make an effort.
You're putting it in very cognitive, intellectual terms.
I don't know.
But, but what I perceive in you and in other monks is there's a level of fundamental modesty about what can be accomplished by any human being. I think of this when you often say, and with my little bit of knowledge about this, but it's not false modesty. So how does one learn that kind of modesty in one's aspirations, that we can't all shoot to the moon, we can't all be Mozarts, but we can be helpful? It isn't just knowledge, it's, I think, more, it's a whole personality feature.
He's only saying that our humility comes from the fact that we lost our home, we lost our country.
We are refugee, so we become humble. I think, I'm more serious. I think the other also get you on that level Mongo shows coordinate.
No. So yesterday we had a discussion about how there's a tremendous amount of synchrony that goes on at the brain level.
I think one thought or one action, see, without Kazoda, not come just one single gene or something.
Neuron.
Thousands, millions, billions of the neuron, the cooperation.
Cooperation.
Then you see certain thoughts or certain actions will come. So similarly, the changing our view or changing our mind, right? Now this is in the Buddhist field, right?
No, in the Buddhist field.
Not just one single course, single sort of meditation. But I think, hopefully not billions, but at least the thousands, so different things. Practice, think, practice, then all these connected, then eventually our perception change, right? And perception change or outlook change.
Now outlook changes.
It automatically bring dangerous behavior.
Affects the day-to-day behavior.
Of course, the negative emotions comes, but you see, there is some kind of the feeling of reluctance. Is it to
embrace
receive
them.
that?
Now to embrace them.
So that makes a difference. Then, of course, the time factor also very important. I'm sure the change will not take place within 1 week, isn't it? I think many years meditation and also environment. Maybe Kishila, Matthew, when you remain longer period in Paris, because of the a nice monk may become a little bit stupid. So he prefer spend more time in Nepal, in isolated area. So Buddha himself also told like that. So there's at the low level, the environment influence also very, very important.
Very strong.
But I think
more and more inner strength increase, then not much influence from external
From the environment.
I think we cannot stress enough the power of the inspiration that can come from wonderful human beings. I mean, you mentioned how much His Holiness changed your life.
Yes.
And I can say that I don't have any special quality except the inspiration that I receive from extraordinary human beings who are my teacher. I'm sort of, a friend of mine described himself as an irradiated guinea pig. So much radiation of goodness, of loving kindness, of inner strength, of inner freedom, that somehow, it says that the birds that fly around the golden mountain, somehow there's a reflection of that gold. So it's the inspiration, and that's also in education. Unless you have inspiration from the educators, how can you hope that, it's just do what I said, don't do what I am, or don't do what I do, then how can it work?
Yes.
So the strength of the inspiration of wonderful human beings somehow is the most powerful inspiration for transformation.
And I'd also like to add, if I might, that there is an important feature of cognitive work. I mean, you've been saying, well, that's cognitive, what's practice? But cognitive work is practice. In the Lojong tradition in particular, mind training tradition, that's part of the practice. So there's a verse, for example, in the 8 verses of mind training that says, whoever I'm with, I will always see myself as the lowest and hold others from the depth of my heart as better than me. And that's a kind of way of proceeding through. You can bring that verse into your mind when you're starting to feel yourself feel arrogant. You recall that verse to mind, and it's a way of constantly making your day, as you go through the day, one in which you're being humble. But you do that by sitting and reading the text and thinking about it and meditating a little bit about it. It's not as if the cognitive work is separate from the practice. It's part of the practice.
I want to talk about 3 sherabs.
Yes. So basically, in the process of practice, one is trying to develop wisdom overall. But there are actually 3 kinds of wisdom. One form of wisdom is the wisdom of learning. One learns a particular, for example, in the context of mind training, one would learn different types of techniques that are meant to counteract self-cherishing. One might read the Bodhicharya Avatara, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, and study it. This is learning. And then having learned, for example, the verse that said, if there's something I can do about it, why get upset? If there's nothing I can do about it, why get upset? When one then contemplates the meaning of that, what is the point of this? Well, I'm not getting upset because I don't get upset focusing on the small things, as it were. I have a larger goal that I'm trying to move toward, a realistic goal. And then one actually, having thought about it and really understood the meaning of this, then in meditation one tries to actually directly understand it, not in a conceptual way, but in a non-conceptual way. So there's learning, and then contemplation, and then taking the meaning that one has contemplated and trying to really directly understand it. And so this is that process of familiarization, a very deep level of familiarization, such that it really becomes natural or automatic. And you don't have to think about it anymore.
Then real effect come. Just knowledge.
Can you say a little more about that third way?
Non-conceptual way means when you have reached to a kind of certainty that there's no need to worry. There's a kind you are put in a different mental state at that time. Or say when you arouse loving kindness and compassion very powerfully upon an object, you reach a certain feeling. But now usually it goes right away. Here, the third part, non-conceptual, means to let it soak in for a while, not just to move to something else, but let it completely permeate your being, and that requires some time of remaining with that understanding. We don't have to understand it further, but you have to remain for a while, cultivate it.
Evan, you had a comment you wanted to make.
This actually connects to what John was just saying about wisdom, because if we connect the present discussion back to the earlier discussion of altruism, and we look at these 6 criteria for altruism that were given, it's striking that there's no mention of anything like wisdom. There's no mention of anything like knowledge or ethical cognition or ethical know-how. So to take the example of the man who runs after the mountain lion, I don't know the actual circumstances of that particular action, but that action in general is quite consistent with something that is foolish and from another standpoint could be judged to be unethical. So suppose that this man had children who were dependent upon him for their welfare and he's putting himself in danger, or other people rely on this person critically, then this act, although impulsively altruistic in some sense, could be a kind of foolish altruism. So I think it's very important that we remember that wisdom has to be in this conceptualization of altruism that we're working with. Otherwise, we're not really working with something that has any real cognitive depth and cognitive and emotional balance to it. And I just think that that's especially crucial for Westerners in thinking about things, because we focus in on something like compassion, and we have a tendency sometimes, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I think that in general we often have a tendency to isolate it from other virtues, all of which together constitute wisdom or ethical know-how or knowledge.
But the very quintessence of Buddhism is the union of wisdom and compassion. That's the very, very summary of Buddhist path.
Well, I like what you...
So we did mention being realistic as one component, but being realistic is actually
knowledge, awareness,
wisdom.
That wisdom is real. That's part of wisdom.
Is it?
Put
it into the gymnasium.
Yeah, it should probably be. Well, and also, actually, the point here was also made that the practitioner who's trying to practice the Bodhisattva path is focusing primarily on a very subtle kind of suffering, which is the suffering that comes of ignorance. And so what that practitioner is trying to do is actually study especially the nature of reality, and then to contemplate that. And then the wisdom that they're seeking in meditation is the wisdom that directly realizes the nature of reality itself, so that they can eliminate their own ignorance and help others to do that. So really wisdom is a major, as Matthew just said, the Bodhisattva path has both compassion and wisdom, both method and wisdom. It's key.
Well, I like that.
The same is true for Shravakas.
All Buddhist
path.
Thinking of these as two things that get put together, I like a lot, because in some of the examples of these rescuers, where they rescued one 12-year-old child and were putting in jeopardy their own 3 children. Was that wise to do? What they tell you is that they had to do it. You could say in some sense the compassion itself wasn't based on wisdom, which doesn't mean that you don't want to combine wisdom with compassion. I like the wholesome emotions. I would like to switch to another topic, which is, can all emotions, and of course I have my own peculiar definition of what an emotion is. So hatred is not an emotion, and attachment is not an emotion. Emotions are...
Well, that makes things easy.
Anger is, though. Anger is. And we could go into why hatred isn't, but I won't do that yet. We have spent a lot of time talking about that. You said afflictive mental states create disturbance and a loss of self-control. We tend to lose our freedom to act in accordance with our aspirations and be caught in a distorted mindset rooted in a deeply self-centered way of relating, and I couldn't agree with you more that that's afflictive. The question I'm posing is, can emotions including anger, and I think I already know your answer to this, be acted in a way that does not eliminate the freedom to act, that does not distort our view of reality, and does not involve a loss of control. Albeit, Wolf mentioned, I think yesterday, I'm losing my sense of when things happened on which days, that there is a narrowing of attention that can occur. I've called this a refractory period, during which you don't even have access to all of your own knowledge in memory, only to what fits. But that can be useful if it's only a very short period. And so there's correction. So the it's focusing attention, not to, if we can distinguish that from distorting reality. Distorting reality, you see things that aren't there, rather than just focusing on this immediate problem and what seems relevant, but that has to widen.
But distorting reality can include phenomena other than things that aren't there. It can also include misperceptions of things that are there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that occurs for a systematic reason. That is, it doesn't occur by accident.
But that's still distortion.
I would agree.
And somebody could do ne kana chik rangtön zo cheche di jesu chuk de chik kechu sum so what was the point about the refractory period?
Just that it does narrow attention. It doesn't necessarily, but it's a brief narrowing. It narrows attention both to the outside and to what you know.
But your point is that this is not necessarily a distortion of reality. It's simply a narrowing.
A narrowing of attention.
That's true. Yeah. For example, you can, in the case of a practitioner who has got a, quite. So His Holiness was saying that he actually knows some individuals who has this skill of maintaining single pointedness of their attention to the point where they get to a state where even if there is a noise around or someone may be walking in the front, they're totally oblivious because of the total attention paid to their object of meditation.
Positive number 그들이야. 또 우리랑 공부를 시작을 제조절 시제도 주전에 연영상 초과 매수 저도. 세시도 이거 때 있잖아요. 도와.
제가 positive.
게임을 드시는.
So
자바로 심심하게 그들이야. 아니 감시하시는 말씀이지. 그걸 다른 로 positive 들어도.
There was a
glass.
His Holiness was referring to a Tibetan master from a Drepung monastery, whom he knew very well.
I received some teaching.
He
top scholar.
He had this.
As well as good practitioner.
So he had this tremendous skill of total focus. So when he would be teaching, and then he would be reflecting upon a chain of, thought, and then when he gets into this total absorption, then sometimes he's oblivious to what's happening around him.
If I can carry this to one more step, and that is if we take your definition, this is from your book, that wholesome mental factors are based on whether the acts give rise to one's ethical well-being, then I'm envisioning, even with anger that's directed at the act and that's compassionate for the actor, but stops injustice, that would meet your criteria of ethical well-being, so that anger, as well as other emotions, if they facilitate further cooperation and collaboration between people, then they are wholesome.
연합적으로 시다 말다 공도
Control plus.
공도의 지금 다 해도다 염제다 다 공도의 그 견제제 내가 견제제 셴변제 두고 그러 제 두고 요인자스 아니 공도 개백이
그래서 공도가 시단 역할이죠.
그래도
뉴스는 그 말에 장년된 인유지 요할지 되고
나래는 다들 뭐 중원에다 요 말에 나오
공도서 초어서 저걸 가가래. 공도도 초
가가래
가
초어디 심중
인유나
맞지요
시다 장유로
지다 보는 지가 control이는 미교인이 막혀버려.
그래서 그러나서는
저다 같은 좀 셋당사 별에 치고하시고 별에 치고야 돼야 셋에 당스르디 규구는 인지세 규구는이야 셋한께서 오서는 당스 맞을수가
자성 부르죠.
다 공도스 라베이나 공에 쳐 지다 가서 그래 다 근데 당도 밀리면 지들이 옆에 신도 민디별로
나래는
그다 저 댄디별로 쭉 쳐보지 그토래다 남주 주부터야
주면으로죠.
진짜지 닝지 그냥 하는 용되거든
그래서 미교의 연구 말이.
이거 말이다
So His Holiness
대상도 마세베 교육으로 다 닝지 다 가서 또 전부 여봐 이나 다 제단 용어몇 군을 나한테 아니 자원띠 벌도 돼야지 그다 닝지 군을 나한테 겨울도 돼야 돼
no. This is partly an internal discussion here about the Tibetan technical Tibetan terms for anger versus hatred. His Holiness was saying that in the case of anger, kongdro, he can invest, and there is a recognition that you can have anger which is motivated by compassion, and then you can have an immediate state of mind of anger that is, that feels a sense of outrage to an unjust act. And this is a very rough state of mind, but because it is motivated by compassion. So, and it's actually the kind of the quality of the mind and its relation to the object, which is the unjust act. And there is the state of mind is that of a repulsion. It's an expression of a repulsion. You want to repulse that act, and so it's also a very kind of a rough state of mind, but it can lead to positive consequences because it is motivated by compassion. But in contrast, he cannot imagine something similar with hatred. You cannot have a hatred that is motivated by compassion that leads to a positive action. Because hatred presupposes ill will.
Evil.
Ill will.
Ill will.
Yeah.
So there's no place of compassion.
My conceptualization of it is slightly different but compatible, that anger can be at an act, not at the actor. Hatred is at the actor, fundamentally. It is for that person. Whatever they do, you still hate them. And so therefore it cannot be controlled.
So in that case, you wouldn't have... So can't you have hatred towards the unjust act as well?
Well, I wouldn't call that hatred, because the other characteristic of hatred is that it endures. Anger can be just for a few minutes or seconds, but hatred is a permanent mental state. As long as you hate that person, it's always there.
Yeah, but even with anger, if the motivation is to harm,
Yes.
Then
it
it's
has
it's
no
destructive.
excuse whatsoever.
Yes, I would agree. Then it's not constructive. Because when you harm,
hatred the thousand unions there chane the 강사 거래서 있나? 강사 거래 있나? 미스고 되어서.
나래도 그런 대결에서 그러다 간다. 대결 말아봐도 대결에서 그래.
맞아. 콜라비 누구 말이야? 콜라야 여러.
나래.
마시 콜러 거로.
나래.
진짜 강사고 되더로.
I know, but we have.
아나.
나고 되더로.
나래. So 가르쳐라 그냥 고마서.
맞아. 미치리야 코너 잡고 싶지.
나래.
낙선 주고 싶지 왜이나? 미들 낙선 끼버리 스타트스로 와.
나래.
제다가다 디 자와들 낙선 끼버 말이 미들 낙선 끼버리. 둔젠디 코너 세르이나? 자와들 코너 세르이나? 축축스. 전도 되그리스. 교도 되그리스. 단 낙선디 미코라소 인지잖아. 미코라소 둔젠디 유능부 되도스.
나래.
에이네 미스가 뭐 낙선 자대가 있나? 미코 다가 되도.
나래. So if hatred is directed to the person, and
then that hatred must remain till the death of the person. But
does
that's
it
not
last
the case.
that long?
No, you can. It can.
1 year or 10 years, then afterward, isn't that hated person eventually become your best friend?
I agree with
So
that
still
too.
same person.
Yes, but you have changed.
Oh, so that.
또 가사구나 주어 되어로 봤을 때 있잖아요.
pero 강사 요 마태 이거 봐. 소수 친지 소수로 튀니. 벌써 되게 삼나 미세다 소수나 만들었지. 소수 내려서 개면에 지금 들으시고 와네. 해주지 말래.
나래.
미 자와상 부 지내지야 차도 쉽게 있나?
나래.
해줄 게도.
나래. 아니
저서 안 듣대 안 가서도 유명발 미국 사람 간다.
나래. 간다 강사 미국에서 해르스나 강사 미국에서.
그래서 강사 안다 요요야 이 자왕 야바 인사 요 주고서 그러 간다.
말 미국으로 줘.
미국 요원들 해야 그러시.
So why how would the person change in the case of someone who has hatred towards?
I think there can be many reasons.
But in any case, essentially, action and the actor, the person, still separate.
Yes, in hatred, in hatred it is about the person, not just the specific act. In anger, it can be just about removing the obstacle that person.
로랑가를 지난 화도 때문에 코르스도 미코라 코르스도. 왜 주주도 소는 시리. 선절 코르스가 말이. 미디 용원의 코르스가 말이. 디바라데 미코 늑지 수제세. 뭐시 차단께서 유틀 늑지 따그 고도. 그래서 미코 따그를 뭐도 그 자와를 다시 미미도.
But generally when you have strong emotion of anger towards someone,
so that 미디 덴두지 로리야 샤임도. 디스압도.
You do target the person. You don't make the distinction. You actually, for you, the object of anger is that person, and not only that, but also
I think any negative action, destructive action, is based on illusion, right? Because you see the indication is when negative emotions come, you see there must be some target.
So negative emotions don't really take into account complexity. It's always focused on some concrete target.
That target also absolute, independent, never changing. That kind of appearance, isn't it?
Well, that's a very unskillful version of an emotion.
But that may be the way the negative emotions typically arise.
But we don't know for certain, do we?
No, but I think that's what Your Holiness is suggesting, particularly in the case of anger.
당연히 안 되셔야 되지. 가서 해주지
가사를 미쳐버렸어.
어디 자활을 미고마도 콘도 세베 그돌이야 강사고라 콘도서도.
Because when anger arises,
자 안데 보고 안데 앵가디 아니 자활 미그리스. 미쳐버렸어. 와 아니 해주지 강사고라 미그리스. 그래 이제 강사들 요번시 모두 쭉 다 되그리스. 유는 되그리스 나와.
His Holiness is questioning this distinction that hatred is directed to the person and anger can be directed to the act. Because when you have strong emotion of anger, without hatred, anger, it is directed to that person in its entirety. Just this, the person becomes the object of your anger.
Well, there's nothing permanent about what I'm suggesting. It's an attempt to make distinctions. It is very likely that you're right that anger starts in all human life to hurt the actor. I would like to think that isn't built into anger, and that what's built into anger is removing the obstacle to my goal, and that you can learn that the least effective way of doing that is hurting the actor. Because the actor will then, unless you eliminate them, they'll then be retributive. And when I asked a developmental expert who studies anger in the first year or two, this is Campos, he says it's open question. That as to whether we learn to hurt or we have to unlearn not to hurt in anger. But we do agree, I think, on the fundamental point that if the anger is directed at the actor, it's destructive. If it can be at the action with concern for the actor about how they can achieve their goal without hurting or blocking you, it's wholesome. Because there are many people in the West who believe that the Buddhist view is to never have any anger. And I don't think that is the view that you've put forward, at least in some of your writings, where you talk about this anger at the action, not at the actor, and the necessity for stopping harm with force.
다시 디슈션이 우리 낙선장들이잖아요. 숙제도와. 앵가 소소는 가보니 우지게 지금 먼저 주는 동나인 거로. 다들 낙선 패지 말. 다 낙선 계속잖아요. 다 거로 식선 나로 포함. 다들 낙선 뒤로. 그 숙제도와. 저거 가사를 위해서 배치하고요. 또 도시아의 시합이나.
Maybe there is something in what you were saying about the fact that hatred is directed to the person, not to the act. Because if you look at the way in which we experience anger, say, for example, towards our friends or family members as opposed to someone that we hate. So in the latter case, there is ill will in it. And whenever there is ill will, the anger that you feel tends to be much more intense and long-lasting.
And usually, I think, am I your friend? Due to some of their misbehavior, you may lose anger.
Yeah.
But no ill feeling. So this case, as long as they are wrong because of the misbehavior, there are some anger. As soon as that behavior change, you see, no longer that anger. But ill feeling, not that way. Even that person, you see, showing you a smile or something, still you feel, oh.
Such great performance. Could be an actor. So where does ill feeling arise?
From the sky.
Well, I think our day has come to a close, Your Holiness.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you very much.
No.
So, yes.
Ignorance.
Serious. This self-centeredness was one of the factors that you listed as an unwholesome mental state, afflicted. Yeah, that's the source.
So to me, it always comes back to the issue of the grounding or outlook that the person has in life. That's the fundamental. That is, in some sense, the answer to all of the questions.
Yeah, that's true. No. So this is quite true, because when you have ill will, what the other person does subsequently doesn't seem to make much impact. If you have a strong ill will, it's very definite. What the other person does later, subsequently, doesn't seem to have much impact. But on the other hand, if it is just an anger, when the object of the anger of the person, when something changes, your emotions changes too.
I agree now. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Holiness.